Good evening and welcome to our webinar on energy democracy. Thank you all for joining. We have a fantastic lineup tonight with speakers from Trocaire, Cliona Sharkey. We have Paul Kenny from the Tipperary Energy Agency and John Fogarty from Tipperary Wind Farm and Community Power, Ireland's first and only community-owned electricity supplier. Thanks for all of you for joining. I see here people from all over Ireland and some from outside of Ireland, so you're all very welcome. In Ireland, our energy principally comes from fossil fuels, how we power and heat our homes, how we move around the world. And historically, our electricity system has come from very large fossil fuel plants with very little regard really for how the extraction of those fossil fuels impacts people, the environment, and the climate in different parts of the world. That is changing, thankfully, and renewables are increasingly contributing to Ireland's electricity system, particularly. Last year, we got to about 40% renewable electricity, and there are plans to increase that to 70% over the coming years. So tonight, we're going to talk about this transition and how do we build it so that it's done fairly, robustly, and is safe for the climate, and collectively, how do we share in the common goods that is the renewable energy that's all around us. So organisations all over Europe and the world are calling for changes to our energy system to ensure that this new model that we're building, it's built by the people, for the people, and that we can all participate in it and deciding how our energy is produced at a local level, and we can have a share in the ownership of that, and of course the benefits too. So firstly, we have Cliona Sharkey here from Trocaire. Cliona is going to take us from the local out to the global for a while to start us off. We're all connected to global struggles. I think now more than ever are we more and more aware of that. Sometimes we don't even know we're participating in global problems or global struggles. Cliona is here to show us the work that Trocaire does in communities all over the world that are the front lines of climate change and resource extraction. Thanks, Cliona.
Typhoon to make landfall. You'll remember Typhoon Haiyan. And then the bottom right-hand corner was Doyola, internally displaced persons camp in Somalia. And some of you will be aware that often in these parts of the world where there's really complex, protracted crises involving conflict and things like that, there are also these climate-related factors underlying the conflict and displacement. Move on. Moving on from climate justice, I suppose, as Kate mentioned, there's so many aspects to the idea of climate justice and the idea of looking at energy and the energy sector transition is a huge one in terms of the rights of and the need for protection of workers as certain sectors are transitioned out, and the need to ensure that new jobs are robust and rights-based, and that there's the ability to unionize and all those things. So there's so many levels to the climate justice imperative. Two of the things I suppose that particularly concern the work that we do as Trocaire would be obviously the overall issue of ambition, ensuring that we do enough quickly enough as Ireland according to our responsibility, the emissions that we have here in Ireland, that we are doing enough. Another thing about climate justice is the how we take action. So what kind of policy we're doing here, what kind of investment decisions are being made, and what impact that has on people in developing countries. So I'll come back to that later on. So on to the energy aspect. So I wanted to give you some flavour of the global energy picture. Now, this is not my background, so I relied on the UN for these stats. So globally, 9 out of 10 people worldwide have access to electricity. So that sounds pretty good, you would think, but actually behind that figure is the other side of the picture. So within that, 3 billion people, in that context, 3 billion people still lack access to clean cooking fuels and technology. And that's not clean cooking fuels in a kitchen as we know it. That's having an indoor stove in which you're doing all your cooking, all your heating of water in an informal settlement where all that smoky fuel is in your living space, affecting your health. 87 million of the 840 million, so 840 million do not have access to electricity, and the vast majority of them live in rural areas. So this is, I think, an interesting parallel for some of the discussions here about energy democracy and that idea of decentralization and local ownership. So in this context of it, it's clear that like we're in an energy transition, but actually there's a huge swathe of people in the world who currently don't have access to electricity, never mind to the modern clean renewable energy that is needed. So some of you will be familiar, I'm sure, with the Sustainable Development Goals, and one of those goals is Goal 7 around affordable and clean energy. So there is a goal that by 2030 to ensure access to affordable, reliable, sustainable and modern energy for all. So alongside our global climate commitments, there are these commitments related to social and economic development, including access to energy. And the Sustainable Development Goals, as you might know, are relevant to all countries, not just developing countries. So looking at the commitments for developed countries can be of use and interest in work at the national level here. Another thing that's important to point out is that we know we need to make the big transition, and at this point, only 17.5% of total final energy consumption comes from renewable energy, and that's a stat from the UN from 2019. So we know that is needs to and will change over the next years, but how it will change is obviously a key question: how quickly it will change and how it will change. So this is where I want to highlight to you some of the risks and opportunities in this transition, this global climate and energy transition. This is something that as a development and justice organization, we would be particularly concerned with. So according to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the report they put out in 2018, it is possible to meet the limit to warming of 1.5. And it is actually possible to do so in a way that also aligns with the Sustainable Development Goals. So we can go through this climate and energy transition in a way that also tackles social and economic poverty and inequality, or we can do so in a way that actually exacerbates those issues. So depending on how we go about these transitions, we can either realize synergies, or we can realize trade-offs, so see negative impacts on social and economic poverty and inequality. So now I'm going to turn to Sian and ask her to put on the video for us. So Trocaire, just to explain before it starts, because I suppose as a development organization, we're looking globally at the prospects of this energy transition and at the opportunities, but also the risks to people on the ground. So this video we're showing you is part of our new campaign on corporate accountability, to try and make sure that people who are trying to live sustainably at the local level and protect their environment can do so without being tackled by large corporates. Okay, I let you watch the video and I can continue after.
You can see the screen, okay?
I can't view it yet.
sabemos que pues nuestra vida está ligada a procesos más grandes, a una historia, a una lucha colectiva y que pues para nosotros no hay más camino que la justicia y la dignificación de los pueblos.
Nunca es tarde para solidarizarnos, ¿verdad?, con los que se han convertido en mártires por defender la naturaleza, por defender los bienes, nuestros bienes comunes, y que las empresas transnacionales, con tal de adquirir lo material, lo económico, no se dan cuenta que cada árbol que corten en el mundo, que cada río que se seque en el mundo, es un bien natural que nos afecta a todos, a todos. Vemos pues las consecuencias del cambio climático, aunque don Trump no crea en él, ¿verdad? Bueno, ahí estamos pues apoyándonos, y esa solidaridad de todo el pueblo de Honduras y sobre todo del pueblo internacional, de las rebeldías del mundo, nos han hecho pues superar esto. Y
So I go back to share my screen, I think, is that right?
Yeah.
So thank you for your patience, everyone. I hope you got something from that video, and some of you might be wondering what's this connection with energy democracy then? And I'm still trying to change my screen now. So I suppose how this connects with this idea of the energy transition is that attacks on human rights defenders. So human rights defenders essentially means civil society activists. In the NGO community, we call them human rights defenders, people who are acting on the ground to defend human rights or environmental rights. Them being attacked and subjected to harassment and abuse by corporations and indeed governments is not new. But what is new is the fact that it is increasing. And the other and most concerning thing is that it is likely that given this huge energy transition that we have to see globally, how this is going to change investment and policy trends and things like that, there's a risk that there's going to be a significant, dramatic increase across the world in competition for land, for resources, for the building of mega projects and things like that. That could have a disastrous impact on these very front lines of the climate and energy transition. So I finally managed to change my slide. That's just some facts and stats for you. So the increasing demand for renewable energy is putting additional demands on land. 13% of documented attacks on human rights defenders in 2018 were related to renewable energy, and 47 cases in 2019. And you'll see in the video and also in our reports, our policy reports in this area, we draw particular attention to women. This is because, as in all areas, women are particularly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. And they also experience particular abuses and forms of harassment as human rights defenders because of their gender. And yet they're showing incredible leadership at the local levels in terms of innovation, but also the courage in terms of challenging these corporations. And you see at the bottom there the different types of harassment. So in some cases, violence and even murder, and in other cases, then it's judicial harassment, so bringing of criminal proceedings. Go to the last one. So just stepping back and reflecting on these connections, connecting the global and the local. I suppose in terms of energy justice and facing into this transition, it's clear that all energy policy and investment decisions need to be challenged. So there is simply no room for any more investment in the continuation and expansion of fossil fuels. We know that the reserves of fossil fuels held by companies and governments is already well more than is aligned with the carbon budgets for the global climate goals. And yet we know that over the last years and also in the current context that these companies will be we're looking for support, looking for continued policy and investment support, and even in the current crisis, we'll be looking for economic support because of the impacts on their business because of the COVID crisis. And then ambition and solidarity. So of course we need to demand greater ambition at all levels, and to focus in our demands both for ambition and solidarity. So in the context of the energy transition, particularly here also at the domestic level, really conscious of people who are experiencing energy poverty in Ireland and the people who will be affected in terms of their jobs and their communities in the transition, and connecting that then to the global justice dimension. So ambition in that we need to protect the most vulnerable people and countries from the worst impacts, and solidarity in that we do not make policy and investment decisions, whether in relation to fossil fuels or renewables, that are actually going to have detrimental impacts on the people on the front lines. And then finally, on corporate accountability, Trocaire has a campaign now on campaigning for Ireland to support the UN Treaty on Business and Human Rights. So if anyone is interested in more information about that, I'd be happy to speak afterwards. Thanks very much. I hope I kept to time.
You did. Thanks, Cliona. Before we move on to the lovely Paul Kenny from Tipperary Energy Agency, I have a question for you all who are attending. And I suppose it's about thinking about the global and the local. I suppose at the moment, the world has changed forever. And I think we're all very aware of how connected we are to global struggles the coronavirus is one, but that we're connected all the time to global issues. Sometimes we don't even know about it, and we're participating in something that we're not even aware of. But I think the coronavirus has taught us that we are all very connected, how close the global really is to all of us, and how individuals are really connected to each other and have to kind of respond in these situations with solidarity and with support and with care and looking after each other and our environment. So our question is actually about fossil fuel companies and greenwashing. And I'm going to ask you all to put your answers into the chat function if you can. Have you experienced Irish fossil fuel companies getting involved with greenwashing? And what does that look like? So some of you might know about Beyond Petroleum, BP, and their tagline, which is, working on making energy cleaner. The reality is 96% of their investment still goes into fossil fuels. So that's the kind of thing that's blatant greenwashing, and they've been called out on it many times by many other NGOs in recent times, but it's happening on an Irish level, and so that's our question. You can answer that as Paul is speaking.
I'll just introduce myself for a second. I'm Paul Kenny. I work in the Tipperary Energy Agency. I borrowed a sign from work this shoulder. So I'm going to basically do a Cliona's screen is unshared.
Yep.
There we go.
Yep. There we go now. That's sorted.
Okay.
Could everybody else please mute their mics?
I will apologise if there's any local noise. Kids are upstairs having a bath, as happens now that we all work from home. So that's disappeared. That's okay. Yeah. So basically today I'm going to talk a little bit about ourselves, what we do, what our energy transition looks like in Ireland. I'm going to talk a little bit about heat because I think John is going to spend a little bit of time on electricity. And really, I think just maybe putting some clarity around what that means for us in Ireland and what we need to do and be focused on. And I just wanted to be a little bit optimistic in a pessimistic time, and why I think democracy has made a big difference in Ireland and the efforts we've made in terms of the energy transition. To start, we usually have a picture of the energy agency standing in front of our building, but I thought today, with everyone working from home, I'd just share a couple of images of the various different staff members in their house and so on. So the energy agency, the Tipperary Energy Agency, was set up in Tipperary in 1998 as part of a European movement to have local energy agencies support their local and regional communities. So we are governed and run by the local authority, Limerick Institute of Technology, the local development companies, and we're really set up as a social enterprise to further the energy transition in Tipperary and beyond. We have about 30 staff, there's a few of them there, and they work on a variety of different projects, including supporting community power, but also on residential renovation through our Super Homes brand, and non-residential energy renovation through Sustainable Tip and directly through ourselves. So we have a lot of clients, we have a lot of engineers, and our focus really is about decarbonising Ireland's buildings. So I'm just going to do a quick whistle-stop tour. All this data is from the Sustainable Energy Authority of Ireland's Energy in Ireland 2019 report, really just to put some things in context. So here is where we use energy. So you can see, you know, a certain amount is used in industry, a lot of it is in transport, some of it is in residential, some of it in services, and a very small amount in agriculture and fisheries. So when we talk about decarbonising Ireland, we need to make sure we include transport and heat very much in that. So what's our fuel use? You can see oil, the big blue bar there is most of it, gas and electricity. So if we decarbonise our electricity completely, it doesn't do much as a percentage of the whole job. So we need to really focus on the other two as well. When we look at transport, the private car, aviation, and heavy goods vehicles are the three. So the private car and aviation are the ones that carry people, and they are a very large majority of our energy use in transport. So we need to think about that when we're talking about modal shift from cars and away from planes. And I think something tells me that green bar is going to fall very drastically for a long time. So this is our electricity. So it's on the way, it's getting greener. So the green bar that started in 2005 is quite a small portion, is up at about in 2018 just over 32%. But 2020 year to date, I heard today that 50% of our energy is coming from renewables. So I'm delighted to correct Kate and say the majority of our energy now comes from renewables, which is great to hear, as of this month, because it's been so windy. And by 2030, our climate plan intends to get us to 70%. And I can see that being very much a realizable target, but it will require a significant amount of investment in renewables. But electricity is on its way, and that's a good news story. When we look at our carbon intensity of our electricity, so as we move away from the peat, which is the blue bar, and the green, which is an unfortunate colour for coal, you can see it very much decreasing over the last number of years, and our electricity is probably at about 290 grams per kilowatt hour. And that really matters when we move into how do we decarbonise our heat and our transport, because the cleaner our electricity is, the cleaner our electric vehicles and heat pumps will be. So you can see from 2005 to now is roughly about half. And it will halve again by 2030. So in summary, when we look at our energy use, electricity is on track. It needs to move on to 70% by 2030 and on to 100% by 2050. Heat and transport are big challenges. So you can see them collectively together, they're about 68%. And that is our primary energy, so the fuel use going into it. So what we need to do to tackle heat and transport is reduce the amount of energy use. Now, I'm not going to focus on transport today, but the key thing about transport is if you want to transport a person and you carry the person and 1.5 tons of a car, it's going to be very inefficient versus cycling, walking, or public transport. So it's reduction in the energy use needed for transport is a big push away from the private car. And when we do push away, we need to electrify the remaining energy use so that we can get it from cheap electricity. And, you know, when we talk about democracy and energy democracy, that's the societal shift that we need to do in transport and heat. really requires consent and leadership by the citizens and engagement by the citizens, because it is every building that needs to be decarbonised. It is every house. It is every commercial building. It's every SME, but it's also every journey. It's every trip to school. It's every holiday. It's everything. So it's really important that's known by people. When we talk about democracy, it's not just electricity, it's also heat and transport. And I will say that, you know, through the Citizens Assembly, the Climate Change Committee as part of the DOL, the politicians now understand what is needed. They just don't know how to get elected after they implement it. And I know I'm copying someone else's phrase of that. So I'll just talk a little bit about what we do in heat. So a lot of our activities are focused on heat outside of the work with community power and other electricity related things. And heat is really decarbonised through, you know, reducing fundamentally the amount of energy that a building needs through insulation and air leakage and windows and all those other things that we all understand. By switching to heat pumps predominantly, with some biomass, particularly from sawmill residues where it's very low carbon and is a good use for waste product. And when we talk about social justice and democracy and understanding how we help the weakest in society, it's my firm belief that giving people money to pay for fossil fuels is never going to eliminate fuel poverty. It will just push it out to the following week. And if it gets very cold, the fuel allowance doesn't cover the cost of it. If it's mild, you're paying for something you may not need. And you know, I firmly believe that the only way to eliminate fuel poverty is make a home not need a lot of money to heat. So we've been renovating buildings under the Tipperary Healthy Homes program funded by SCAI that get somewhere in the region of an 80 to 85% reduction in the cost of heating homes. So from maybe 2,000 euros down to 300 euros a year. And that's through things like insulation and heat pumps. And in order to get to the idea of every building being retrofitted by 2040, which is what is required for the Paris Agreement glide path for our carbon emissions, we need to really think long and hard about how we enable that, because it's going to be a 50-60 billion euro investment, which is a small percentage of our overall economic investment in Ireland, but it's quite a significant amount, and that's just homes. It's probably in the region of 90 to 100 billion for all buildings in the state. And thankfully, we can look to other EU regions that have made successes, and even more importantly, we can see where their failures have happened and how we learn from them. And one of the things that we have very much focused on learning from other regions, particularly in France and Germany, is the idea of a one-stop shop for home renovation. So that's where we set up our super home service. And essentially what that does is it enables people to get good advice, so through a professional, where we find and work with the contractors to deliver a high quality renovation. We organise grants. In time, hopefully next year, we'll have low cost loans, and we make sure that the job is done to a very high standard, and the person who is making the significant investment in their home, which could be 50 or 60,000 euros, they get exactly what they pay for. And the whole point around that is about giving people confidence and certainty that when they go for this type of super home renovation, they get what they pay for. And in time, what we want to get to is the ability that one easy payment per month can cover the cost of the renovation. And when you take off the energy savings, it becomes quite affordable. And that is our vision, and that's what we want to have certain outcomes that are a fraction of the cost of a renovation today. So just to move on, really, that's what we do in terms of heat. I want to make sure, just as part of us thinking about democracy and thinking about how our endeavours are going to be challenged over the next few years, it's really important that we understand what's needed. And getting rid of cheap energy is going to be hard. Our society is addicted to it. Everything we do is based on cheap transport, and this last 2 weeks is really making that quite evident of how things have changed. We won't like being told what to do, and fundamentally that means we will need to travel less, and we will need to spend money on things that we may not like spending money on, like retrofit. And it will require everything we have. It will require us to throw the kitchen sink at this. And that will be undermined by the fossil fuel industry across everything we do. I hear all the time about hydrogen. I hear ads on TV about how we will decarbonize our fossil fuels and so on. And none of those things work. We see an interesting report out today and yesterday about compressed natural gas buses, how they use and emit more fossil fuels than even the diesel buses. And that's been really promoted in Ireland by particular fossil fuel companies to increase their sale of fossil fuels. So it's very important that we keep our eye on the prize and we have clarity of purpose. And I think Greta Thunberg has allowed us be very clear on that. We must eliminate fossil fuel use. We must take personal leadership. It's not the money. While it is the money short term for some people, long term it isn't. And if we maybe think about what the IPCC have said, if we don't reduce our carbon emissions by 7.6% per annum, we have a 50-50 risk of having an unsafe future. Now, if you think about that sort of risk, that's maybe 50 or 25 times worse than the risk of dying from COVID-19. And that's the sort of risk we're having by continuing to burn fossil fuels at the rate we do. So I'm optimistic, and I want to really provide some optimism as part of today. Through the production of the all-party report on climate action and the government's climate plan, myself and Kate and others spent a lot of time with politicians, and I think personally, regardless of the party, all parties now agree, and most politicians who are involved agree on the main policy issues. There isn't an argument about what's needed from a retrofit or societal point of view. I think the policymakers now get it, so that the officials get it. The picture below is the Commission for Regulation of Utilities, who never really would have engaged with civil society groups in the past at an informal level, other than the formal consultations they do. And that was then down in our building in Care, with myself and John and one of my staff members, Alan, and one of the board members, where we had a really frank discussion about what is needed to support Ireland moving through this energy transition. And one very important thing we don't talk about too much is the European Green Deal. So, a lot of our energy-related legislation comes from European directives, and the directives that are only coming into force in 2020 and 2021 were directives that were recast in 2017, and they will be recast again as part of the European Green Deal and probably live in 23 or 24, and that will really ratchet up ambition. So we haven't even seen the ambition from the last set of directives, and there's more coming. And there's a lot of money behind the Green Deal, so I'm very positive about that. Some other optimism, these are pre-COVID headlines. When I looked at some of the headlines around climate risk, the global capital markets have very much decided that governments will remove carbon from societies because the risk is so high, and they do not want to be the ones holding the shares in these high carbon utilities. The largest coal company in the world, in the US, went bankrupt last year. Climate change made PG&E go bankrupt as well, or certainly into receivership, which is one of the biggest utilities in the US. And all of those financial advisors are now very much pushing the angle of decarbonisation. And when climate risk is applied to banks' balance sheets and funds' balance sheets, and they are made hold climate reserves because they have dirty fuels in their portfolios, they will very quickly want to remove that climate risk from their portfolio. And I see this coming like a steam train over the next 3 or 4 years, and that will reduce the amount of money available for investment in more exploration. And you know, with oil prices, how they have fallen so quickly with the COVID pandemic, we see that those risks are all coming home to roost. So the financial industry isn't going to get back into that. So in terms of my kind of call to action, I think we all need to understand that fossil fuels are the enemy, and they are the one. Fossil fuels are what are causing climate change. And the fossil fuel industry will cling on and greenwash and undermine every decision you make. They want people to buy SUVs, not because they think people need SUVs, because they make more money off SUVs. We're all fine in a Volkswagen Golf. We don't need a Tiguan. The energy future we come to, you must use much less energy and must buy a lot less stuff. And any bioenergy resources that we have. So you'll hear a lot of greenwashing from fossil fuel companies around how we can use bioenergy. It's important to say there are some very sustainable uses of bioenergy, particularly from wastes. So where a sawmill used to burn waste and not be able to use it for anything useful, it's great to see that pelletized and heat buildings. And particularly waste heat will be hugely useful, but the large-scale production of bioenergy as an energy resource will compete with food and wildlife, and will push up the price of food and push down the biomass of wildlife on our planet. And we need to be very careful about taking bioenergy as a solution unless it is sustainable. And a lot of the European legislation has very tight criteria around sustainability of bioenergy, and it's really important that we know that and apply that. But it does also, in terms of the energy transition, we need to think hard about what our personal responsibility is. So we all need to retrofit our homes. We all need to remove fossil fuels from them. We all need to get out of the fossil fuel car and use cycling, walking, public transport ideally, and electric in some cases. You need to make sure you get clean, green and local products, and be careful about where your products come from, and use that purchasing power and your financial power or your investment power to push society and push governments and push corporations and push SMEs buying better products and services. And finally, you need to demand your politicians enable the energy transition to happen at a local level. So that's all my slides. I hope I'm on time. Too late. A little bit over.
That's okay. So some of you might have noticed we got a bit trolled there. I'm going to take this as a positive that we're super popular, and everybody wants to be involved in an evening webinar on energy democracy. We have managed to get those people out who were just in to cause havoc. So really sorry about that. It's not entirely preventable when you are online. You can just get hacked. It's a lesson. Some of you, a lot of you did actually answer the question legitimately, and most of the answers were coming up about gas being green, about gas being a bridging fuel, Gas Networks Ireland, CNG and transport, biogas. These issues came up about Ryanair and planting trees and being low emissions airline. I think a lot of you got the point. Thank you, Paul, for your wonderful contribution. We have a few questions for you there. I wonder if it would be wise, just given the time, that we move on to John, and perhaps you could type some of the answers in, because I think you would have them quite easily there, rather than taking up the time. And then at the end, we'll probably go a little bit over, but we would like to get some people in to ask some questions, and we can get the other ones answered if we haven't got sufficient answers. Would that be all right? I'm going to pass you over to the lovely John Fogarty, who is also in Tipperary. He is one of the founders of the Temporary Energy Group and Community Power, Ireland's first and only community-owned electricity supplier. And they've grown out of a bunch of great different partnerships. some of the attendees here today are involved with from Ireland and from abroad, and we've got great inspiration from some of those abroad, particularly EcoPower, and a shout out to Dirk, who's on the line as well today, which is great. Thank you for joining us. So John, without further ado, I'm going to pass over to you, and we will just unmute you there.
Okay.
Go ahead. Oh, sorry, just before you do, we have another poll. Got confused there. We're not going to open it up to chat into the chat, so it's just going to be a poll. You can answer it in your own time, and it'll just pop up on your screen. Thanks very much. Over to you, John.
Okay, thank you, Kate. Can you hear me okay?
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
Very good. Well, by way of introduction, I'm from Tipperary, which is a mountainy region in North Tipperary, and we developed a wind farm here, which is community owned, and it grew out of a local development plan as far back as the year 1999, 2000. So we started off just 12 months after the energy agency in Tipperary, and it took us the best part of 13 years to construct. So we eventually got the blades turning in 2012, November 2012, and it was fully commissioned in January 2013. Now we're going into our 8th year of production, and it's been very, very successful. It's exceeded our expectations, and we're delighted with it. The one thing that it did emphasize for us was the benefit locally owned generation is to the local economy and the local community. So to us, that prompted us to move on to the next stage, which was the idea of building of establishing a utility that would encourage other communities to engage in generation and to take ownership of generation in their own communities. So we set out to set up that utility, initially to buy the power off of our own wind farm and trade it to our own shareholders. But we were financing the wind farm in 2011 at a time when the financial collapse occurred, and we could only finance it at that time if we sold our electricity to one of the larger utilities, which we did, and we managed to get the wind farm built. But as a follow-on to that, we started to buy electricity from some small generators around the country, and started trading it into the energy market. So from that point of view, we spent 2 to 3 years learning how the generation end of the electricity market worked, and to sort of establish ourselves in it, and know that we were able to trade successfully in the market. So we went from there, I suppose, to engaging with other communities around the area, that we knew that communities trying to enter the space needed help and assistance, and we set about sort of putting ourselves in that space. All the time we were ably guided by the energy agency, and hearing that Dirk is online, we would like to emphasize that EcoPower in Belgium was our inspiration, because Paul and his predecessor Seamus already had working connections with them. So again, a great thank you to Paul and to Dirk, and to yourself indeed, Kate, because Friends of the Earth have always been in that space, and have always been there to assist. So we really did set about trying to encourage those communities and link up with communities. We then, after that 3-year period, we started to supply our own shareholders here in Tipperary, sort of as a pilot scheme. We connected on, I think, 14 to 20 houses initially, and learned how the supply side of the market worked. And that probably, we concentrated on that for 2 or 3 years, taking on some bigger customers as well, because they're all rated in a different way. And we became proficient enough in the operation of it to have the courage and the know-how to become a large-scale supplier. And last year we spent trying to almost a whole year qualifying to become a large-scale supplier, which is an onerous process, but very worthwhile, and was well worth undertaking. So since November of last year, we're now a large-scale supplier. It's important, I suppose, to emphasize that during this period, through being involved in an Interreg European project on community virtual power plants, which also looks into microgrids and local grids, and that we were able to include a number of other communities around the country, energy communities who we knew were interested in the same space as ourselves. So I suppose we progressed to bringing in other energy communities from around the country, namely as Arn Energy, or the energy co-op on the Arn Islands, and there is an energy co-op in Galway, an energy co-op in Limerick, and there is a group of energy co-ops here in Tipperary called ECTC, who are very well led by a neighbouring parish of ours, Upperchurch. They're really entering into the space as well. So all of us coming together, I think, sort of has given a great impetus to the whole idea of community power, and all those energy co-ops have taken a place on the board of community power. So what we're trying to do is evolve community power into a space that it is in the ownership of the energy co-ops around the country. We have been absolutely thrilled that the department and the government have sanctioned a community section in the upcoming RES auction. I think as a result of that, we can almost guarantee there'll be 3 at least 100% community-owned projects looking for a feed-in tariff in that auction. We fervently hope it won't be gamed by the bigger developers and utilities. And you know, we're very confident that the department and the government want that community space to work. So those community energy co-ops, basically there'll be 3 solar parks, hopefully, that'll compete in that auction. All of them will be 100% owned by members of the community or the broader community. If enough support doesn't come from the immediate locality, then it'll be broadened out into the wider locality. So we set out with a sort of a goal of having at least 150 shareholders to start off, so that to enable us to enter into that auction. If those groups are successful in that auction, then ownership of those groups will be widened out even further. We were reluctant enough to try and encourage too many people to get involved early on, in as much as we don't know whether or not they'll be successful in the auction. But it's a wonderful opportunity for people and communities around the country to get involved. Our own local one here in Tipperary, our engagement with the local community on it was interrupted by present crisis. So we stopped holding local meetings to inform the public about it. So anybody who is online who would like to become a shareholder in that Tipperary Community Solar Farm, we'd be delighted and thrilled for them to do so. And hopefully it'll be broadened out even further afterwards. But we stick firmly to the one share to each shareholder, that all shareholders will be equal within the co-op or company, and that idea, that co-op principle will apply all the way through. So we're very much trying to promote the idea of communities owning their own generation, because we have first-hand benefit from it here. Just as an illustration of that, our two turbines here in our own locality generate as much for our local economy as 30 turbines owned by an outside developer would generate in our local economy. And unfortunately, most of those big developments are owned by multinationals eventually anyway. Most of the developers, when they have them at the stage where they're constructed and built, they're sold on to pension funds around the world, pension funds from Germany and Canada and wherever. So those big global conglomerates are present everywhere. And I think Cliona's indication of the damage that they can do in third world countries, and I'm afraid local is global now, that we must start taking ownership in our own communities. We are responsible. We can't leave all the work to or depend upon governments and local county councils. We believe that communities are capable of taking ownership and developing these projects, and especially with the likes of yourself, the Friends of the Earth have been tremendous in lobbying politicians, and the Energy Agency, we just probably wouldn't be anywhere near where we are without them. So there's huge assistance there. We're willing to engage with any community anywhere around the country. We would ask each and every one of them to become either customers of Community Power or shareholders in some of the energy projects, and we would be thrilled and delighted to assist them, maybe that they would be ready for Res 2 or Res 3 in a couple of years' time. So that's basically, I suppose, a full synopsis of where we are at the moment.
Thank you, John. Thank you very much for that. And it's really exciting to have that offer now available to those who are on the call today, and wider, I suppose, following today, that we can all become owners of a wind or a solar park in Tipperary. Hopefully it will be successful in the auction. There's a few questions coming in there about the auction and what it is. I think it's important to say that Irish communities are fantastic. Everybody knows that, but they are some of the best in the world. And it's just unfortunate, I suppose, unfortunate in the kind of sense of the word, that the policy and the legislative environment for communities to actually participate in the Irish energy sector and in the energy transition has been so hostile for such a long time. So the first really positive change is this community preference category in the RES auction that will happen this summer. It doesn't go far enough in a lot of people's minds. Some of the questions here coming in about microgeneration and smaller scale, it doesn't actually address micro generators or smaller generators less than 500 kilowatts to be able to sell their power. So it's for the sort of slightly bigger but developments at that scale. But the opportunity is now open for us all to be able to have a real stake in that, in a solar farm and that's really, really exciting. I hope that the RES option will give a couple of communities around Ireland the opportunity to start generating power and selling it back to themselves through the likes of community power, and that will be really inspirational for others to follow. Really what's happened with communities that have got this far is they have been banging their heads against the wall, breaking down barriers, breaking down rules, and what we need is a much, much smoother and much, much simpler process for other communities to actually see the likes of Tipperary and actually have a realistic path of following it. We know there are significant challenges still around connecting into the grid, and they're only somewhat addressed in changes or forthcoming changes to policy. We have another poll for you, if that's okay. Paul has done wonderful work answering a bunch of those Q&As there. A lot of them were about how do we step up retrofitting, how do we make sure that we include those that are in the rental market, those who and those who are on lower incomes or in fuel poverty or in social housing, and how do we step that up and make sure that it's across the board and fair and easier to access. There are significant challenges because this is not cheap. There's a lot of money required to be involved in that. We have a question here for you about investment. We know that money that gets invested often around the world gets invested into very dirty industries. We're trying to change that by getting people to invest in clean industries, clean solutions. So we have a question here about investment in community energy projects and what do we think is a reasonable investment for people, citizens, communities of Ireland in this case, to take part. One question here from Sean: how available was funding to you developing your project? I guess that's for John or for Paul.
Yeah, well, all these projects, if you can take the risk out of them, funding seems to be readily available. Risk being planning, grid connection, lease, and of course a feed-in tariff. If all of those are in place, generally speaking, funding is available for these projects. As Paul indicated, clearly most of the big investment houses now want to get involved in renewable energy as opposed to any other form of energy. So very much so, the bigger the project, the easier it is to fund it. It's all about taking the risk out of it. And from the community aspect of it, for RES 2, the department and the regulator needs to ring fence some grid together with the feed-in tariff for communities. Otherwise, it'll be just small-scale developers will come back into the space again, because new energy communities coming in looking for a grid connection now. If it happens the way it's been happening all along, there could be a queue of 4 or 5 years. So I think, in fairness, the regulator and networks have indicated a willingness to do something about this, but it has to be done fast and promptly, and it has to be tied in with the feed-in tariff.
Super. There's a question there as well about grid stability and anyone looking at microgrids at a city block level. Paul or John, do you want to answer that one, about what is the role of microgrids and how does grid stability play into this new energy?
It's a good question. And there was another question in terms of the overall grid stability as we move to more variable renewables. So one thing that's really interesting is Ireland has an island grid. So I know there's a couple of the questions have come from abroad. Ireland as an island grid has 50% variable renewables this year to date. So it's been quite windy. And we've got to that position with a very stable grid, and that has happened for a number of different reasons. We have a very good national grid operator that's really focused on delivering large amounts of renewables through the system. We have a certain amount of spinning reserves, so we keep a number of fossil fuel plants, we'll say, turned down so that they can ramp up and down and keep the grid stable. We have a lot of battery projects coming through in 2020, 2021 and onwards. We have a lot of trials going on in terms of, there's a lot of industrial units that have demand response, but that's going to be down to the household level. we've done a couple of trials in super homes with heat pumps, but I know there's a lot of EV trials happening at the same time. So what does that mean? I suppose at a national grid level, there's a certain amount of that, but really what's going to happen over the next couple of years, and what we've been trialing with DSP networks is literally down to the transformer level, where transformers will be there's a new system called Servo that ESP networks have, and that will be looking at each individual transformer and asking for services to either switch down or switch up demand based on what's happening. So that's really interesting. As part of the Community Virtual Power Plant project that Community Power is a partner in, it's been quite interesting to see some of those community-based demand response projects happening at a local level across Europe, and seeing what a district level battery can do in terms of stabilizing the very local grid. So is anyone looking? Yes, there's a huge amount of research at DSO, distribution system operator, so our national grid operator across Europe. And we think, I certainly believe that what we have been trialing in super homes with ESP networks, and in my own home, that having heat pumps be able to switch down and switch up based on the grid congestion is something that is going to be part of our future. Absolutely, 100%.
There's another question there about the offer and the ability for people to buy in and own part of solar projects, wind projects, any other renewable energy project, about whether or not there's any options for people who are on low incomes or in fuel poverty to enable them to take part in this type of energy transition. It's a question I suppose you'd be asked a lot. Is this just for wealthy people?
Yeah, it is a really good question. And right now, in terms of what we're doing as part of Community Power, we need to raise capital for a number of solar farms, and that capital has to come from people who have it available. We'd love to have the model that we've thought about, and we've lobbied a little bit on this, and we hope to see it come in as part of the community participation, the renewable energy participation scheme, where people near renewable energy projects can essentially get a post office loan that is backed by the share, and the first dividend from the share is used to pay back for the share, and once the share is paid back, the share is theirs, or else a free share issued to people who live locally. So that's what we've been pushing for. It's not available yet. I know the department were keen to have the renewable electricity participation scheme up and running for the first auction, but they didn't get it over the line, but it will be there for the next one.
I'd also add, Kate, that we're very aware of that, and if we can get past the initial stages of the res, if these developments are successful in the res auction, I think we'll find some sort of a means and a way of people to come in with small amounts into the development of these projects. That's definitely our goal, but like Paul indicated, we have to be practical at the early stage. At the early stages, we do need a certain amount of seed funding, and we hope that will all come from the community. But also, there are probably community funds around the place. There are various organizations that have funds on hand that are getting maybe only 0.2 or 3% on interest on them. I think there are groups that would invest in a green project that was clean and community orientated, that they would know their money would be utilized in this way. I think that there are a lot of groups that would invest money in just on getting a reasonable percentage back on their investment. So also we'd hope to introduce that further down along the line, but we are very conscious of cost and trying to include everybody. And if we can get past this initial stage, then we will do everything in our power to enable that.
Yeah, there was a question there from Frank there, which is saying that the price within res is not known, or it wasn't indexing. The question's actually gone. Maybe someone answered it by typing it, but it is.
Yes, I did.
To say that it is actually an auction. It's new for Ireland to be running an auction. So the whole thing is in uncertain water at the moment. You don't know if you're going to be successful in the auction. You don't know what kind of return you're going to be able to offer people. So it's really, really hard at this point to try and get communities bought into the idea of owning their own solar project before the risk is taken out of it. And it's still, there is still a little bit of risk associated with it, because you can't give guarantees to those guaranteed answers to those questions until after the auction has actually happened. And at that point, a lot of the decisions have already been made. So trying to have an open system where you can get loads of people bought into it and participating in it, while it's risky, is you have the potential to cause a lot of harm at that point. You have to wait potentially a little bit until after, and then there's questions as to whether or not it's people had the opportunity to participate from the earliest possible opportunity. So I think this kind of cautious, slowly approach is good at this point, and I think it would be possibly more devastating to people and communities to get people to invest in something that is risky for it to not come through. So we'll be asking people really to be making investments when there's a guarantee.
Yeah, I think also, Kate, I've been speaking about the proposed development here in Tipperary, but the Claire Morris in Mayo are also developing their own project, and they will be given opportunities also probably further down along the line. Likewise, in Galway, Dunmore, SEC there are highly involved in developing the Galway one. And I'm quite sure they will be open to people investing as well. But these are controlled locally, and it is the local people who are done. But we know that they're coming from the same space that we are, and that they want to empower local investment. So that's just an addition.
Okay, it's coming up to 8:20, and I think it's probably been a long evening for us. We have a couple more questions which maybe we could answer offline. I think they might be more appropriate. There's one there that's very interesting, possibly it's from a researcher, about what would you like to have more researched. Lots of things is probably the answer, and there are a good few researchers doing work on this in Ireland at the moment. I want to thank our lovely speakers, all of them, for participating this evening in this new era of an online webinar. For me, it's been a positive experience. So I'm really, really pleased that we managed to pull this off this evening, even though it would have been very nice to be in the Nina Arts Centre, and we would all prefer to be in that life. But we're in the new life now, and we have to get used to it, I suppose, for the time being at least. We're going to have a lot of changes going forward in how we live, how we move, how we think about where our food comes from. I think the positives to focus on are the opportunities that are going to arise to look after people, to look after the environment, to look after ourselves in a way that's better, in a way that really looks after everybody, making sure that decisions are made, take into consideration those who are less powerful or who aren't in decision-making roles or who don't have the ability to influence policy as others can in some of these circumstances. I think there's going to be lots and lots of questions around social justice over the next little while, and I hope that we all make it through. I have lots of faith in humanity, and that's why I'm in this game. So I hope we'll all make it through, and I'm sure we will. I'm really, really pleased that everyone came and participated so well. So I want to thank you all so much for coming, and good night.